Hey, you! Before you watch this, pause the video and subscribe to SemiPro right now.
It's no secret that we're all missing sports right now, and the 2019 NFL season seemed so long ago. So I decided to simulate the entire season over again, and you won't believe what happened. First off, I'd like to preface that this is not a perfect simulation. For some reason, rushing stats were highly inflated, and passing and receiving stats were deflated. And I'd also like to state that I had absolutely no influence over the simulation, and no bias was enforced. With that being said, let's get into the video. During the actual 2019 season, the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl, the San Francisco 49ers were NFC champions, and Lamar Jackson won MVP. Some things would stay the same, some wouldn't. Now the real question, where do we start? Let's start with the AFC East. This division stayed relatively the same. The Patriots were at the top of the division, the Bills and Jets were average, even though this time the Bills would miss the playoffs, and the Dolphins were bad. And by bad I mean they sucked. They didn't have a single rusher over 450 yards, and while their passing game was comparatively better, it didn't lead them to many wins either. The AFC North wasn't as clear-cut as the East. On the surface, the big surprise is the Cincinnati Bengals, who improved from the first overall pick in real life to average, with an 8-8 record, behind surprisingly balanced play from Andy Dalton, who was 8th in passing yards, Joe Mixon, who was an 1,000-yard rusher, which, granted, isn't as impressive as it would be in real life because of the inflated rushing stats, and Tyler Boyd, who finished 3rd in the NFL in receptions. Then there's the Pittsburgh Steelers, whose fate actually repeated itself with terrible quarterback play. Mason Rudolph and Duck Hodges were the only two quarterbacks who threw more interceptions than touchdowns. The only other QB that came close was Baker Mayfield, who threw 20 touchdowns and 20 interceptions. The final surprise in the division is the Ravens, and more specifically Lamar Jackson. In real life, Lamar was the NFL MVP, finishing the season with over 3,100 yards and 36 touchdowns. But his arm was incredibly disrespected in this simulation, finishing with 1,790 yards and 6 touchdowns, making him dead last among all starting quarterbacks by over 800 yards. So you might be wondering how the Ravens still finished the year with 13 wins. And that comes down to their running game. They had a 4-headed monster in the backfield with Lamar Jackson, who was still disrespected, having his rushing yards cut in half, but he was helped by Mark Ingram, Gus Edwards, and Justice Hill, who finished 4th, 14th, and 34th in the NFL respectively, which makes Baltimore the leading rushing team in the NFL by a significant margin. The AFC South was drastically different, but one thing will never change. The Titans will always finish 9-7. But there were two teams who finished with drastically different records than in real life. First, it was the Indianapolis Colts, who won the division with a 12-4 record, and it had a lot to do with Jacoby Brissett, who almost never turned the ball over, which isn't dissimilar to real life, and Marlon Mack, who ran the ball like an absolute madman, finishing with the 5th most rushing yards in the NFL. But everyone knows the Colts had the structure of a good roster. Everyone also knows that Deshaun Watson is the only thing keeping the Texans afloat, and apparently in the simulation, it wasn't enough. Even though Watson played decent, the Texans finished 3-13, which is a far cry from the 10-6 record and playoff appearance they had in real life. But one thing that I take great joy in is that the Jaguars sucked even worse than they did in real life, finishing with the worst record in the NFL, because the Jaguars are bad, and they will always be bad. The final division in the AFC was the best division. Every team in the AFC West finished 500 or better, but that didn't mean it was predictable. In fact, it was exactly opposite of the real life standings. The Chiefs were Super Bowl champions in 2019, but in the simulation, they missed the playoffs with an 8-8 record, and it had nothing to do with Patrick Mahomes or the offense. They played well. The defense was what struggled, as they gave up over 28.2 points per game, which was 8 more than the 20.2 they gave up in real life. And compared to the actual defenses of last season, this would have put them in 30th place. The Broncos, Chargers, and Raiders were all led by the same thing: surprisingly strong quarterback play. Rivers and Flacco finished 1 and 2 in the NFL in passing yards, and Derek Carr finished first in touchdown passes. All three of these quarterbacks led their teams to 10 and 6 records and playoff spots, which none of them came anywhere close to achieving in real life. They played so much better in the simulation that Rivers and Flacco aren't even on the same team now, and Carr might not even have the starting job secured. But that just shows anything goes in the simulation. Moving over to the NFC, the East was dominated by the Cowboys. Dak was 7th in passing yards, 3rd in passing touchdowns, and Zeke was 2nd in the NFL in rushing yards and 1st in rushing touchdowns. This offense was borderline unstoppable in the simulation, but they weren't the biggest surprise of the division. That title belongs to the Giants, who went from the 4th worst team in the league to 9 and 7 and competing for a playoff spot. They were just pretty average in all areas. The biggest improvement was their defense, which was 30th in yards allowed per game in real life and improved to average. Not much changed with the Eagles and the Redskins. The Eagles were fine, the Redskins were bad. That's about it. The NFC North was dominated by the Minnesota Vikings. They finished 8 games ahead of any other team in their division. And if that isn't dominance, I don't know what it is. There were no obvious signs that pointed to Minnesota's success. They were just good. And sometimes that's all it takes. On the opposite side of that coin were the Packers. They finished the year 5-11, which was nowhere near the NFC Championship appearance they had in 2019. The Packers got a lot of breaks last season, winning a lot of one-score games, but they didn't have the same luck in the sim. The NFC South was eerily similar to real life. Every team finished within 2 wins of their actual record, which is very, very strong predicting skills by the sim. The Saints were a few games worse, and the Falcons and Buccaneers were 2 wins better. And I know what you all are wondering: how many interceptions did Jameis throw? It wasn't the 30 that it was during the real season, but it was pretty close. He finished with 26 interceptions compared to his 29 touchdowns, which still isn't the best ratio, but was enough to lead his team into the final playoff spot. Then in the NFC West, if you just looked at the records, it would seem like things stayed almost exactly the same. But 2 teams switched spots: the Cardinals and the Seahawks. Arizona was carried by Kyler Murray and Kenyon Drake. Murray threw for 27 touchdowns and 5 interceptions, and Drake finished in the top 8 in rushing, leading Arizona to an 11-5 record and the playoffs. Seattle, not so much. Russell Wilson was magnificent, but the rest of the team was not, and they finished 4-12. At season's end, Philip Rivers sat atop the quarterback stats leaderboard. Pause the video on these standings if you want to see the top 8 for each position. Derrick Henry was the NFL's leading rusher, and Michael Thomas once again led the league in receptions. It wasn't the NFL record number he had in real life, but that's expected with the deflated passing stats. The MVP race came down to 5 players: Philip Rivers, Joe Flacco, Derek Carr, Dak Prescott, and Christian McCaffrey. And Joe Flacco was the one who pulled out the trophy. How? Nobody knows. But what can you say? Joe Flacco is elite. The playoff seeding worked out in the AFC with the Ravens and the Patriots getting a bye, the Colts and Raiders winning their division, and the Chargers and Broncos securing wildcard spots. In the NFC, it was the Cowboys and Vikings getting a bye ahead of the 49ers and Saints, with the Cardinals and Buccaneers filling out the wildcard. Every single game in the first round of the playoffs were decided by 3 possessions or more. The Broncos pulled off a 29-9 upset over the Colts behind a 2-pronged rushing attack of Phillip Lindsay and Royce Freeman. The Raiders defeated the Chargers 27-9 behind a 193-yard rushing performance by Josh Jacobs and forcing Phillip Rivers into 2 picks. The 49ers killed the Buccaneers 44-6 as the defense forced Jameis Winston into 2 INTs, and Jimmy G threw 4 touchdowns, including 2 to George Kittle and 2 to Emmanuel Sanders. The final wildcard game was a shootout between the Saints and the Cardinals, but the Saints pulled away late to a 47-20 victory. Drew Brees threw for 365 yards and 4 touchdowns, and Alvin Kamara amassed 181 total yards and 3 TDs. The divisional round was a lot more competitive. Every game was decided by less than 2 scores, and it started with a huge upset as the Broncos defeated the Ravens 21-20, where history repeated itself for Baltimore with an early exit, where Joe Flacco surprisingly outplayed Lamar Jackson. I never thought that would happen. The Patriots defeated the Raiders 24-10 behind 2 Julian Edelman touchdowns. Dallas defeated New Orleans 37-28 as Dak Prescott threw for 3 TDs, and the 49ers eked by the Vikings, winning 27-24 behind 3 Jimmy G touchdowns. Only the championship games remained, with only the 49ers, Cowboys, Broncos, and Patriots left standing. The Broncos' journey ended in the championship game, losing to New England 27-19 as Tom Brady outdueled the league MVP. In the NFC, the 49ers squeaked by the Cowboys 20-14 to advance themselves to the Super Bowl once again. The stage was set for the Super Bowl between the Niners and the Patriots, and it was close, but the Niners did what they couldn't do in real life, pulling out the victory 21-17, with the Super Bowl MVP going to Jimmy Garoppolo with 182 yards and 2 touchdowns. If you've made it this far in the video, make sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed this type of content, let us know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching.